America's most prestigious families. Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes. The founders behind Yale and Harvard are celebrated as pillars of national greatness, symbols of philanthropy, education, and elite leadership. But what almost no one is ever taught is that these families became rich in the exact same way, by flooding China with opium on an industrial scale. They shipped thousands of tons, created millions of addicts, reaped profits of 400% or more, and then spent 2 centuries burying the evidence beneath libraries, museums, and carefully rewritten family histories. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose face is immortalized on Mount Rushmore and whose leadership is credited with saving America from the Great Depression, came from a fortune built on drug trafficking. His privileged upbringing, his Harvard education, and the political machine that elevated him to the presidency were funded by wealth earned from selling highly addictive narcotics to China. Millions became addicted. Millions died. And the Delano family became extraordinarily rich. And they were not alone. The Astors, once the wealthiest family in the United States, expanded their empire with drug money. The Forbes family, whose name now adorns one of the most influential business magazines in the world, built its early capital from opium profits. Yale's Skull and Bones, the elite secret society that produced presidents, CIA directors, and senators, was established with money connected directly to opium smuggling. Harvard buildings, celebrated for their architectural beauty and academic prestige, were paid for with silver, extracted from Chinese addicts. These families formed the backbone of American aristocracy, and the institutions they funded still shape the leadership class of the United States today. Yet almost none of this appears in official histories. It has been cleansed, polished, and replaced with heroic narratives that conceal the darker origins of elite American wealth. The truth survives only because records survive letters, shipping logs, financial ledgers, and corporate archives scattered across the United States, Britain, and China. What they collectively reveal is stark. America's most respected dynasties built vast fortunes through a drug trade so destructive that modern society would classify it as an international crime against humanity. They poisoned an entire nation, destabilized its economy, helped trigger 2 wars, and then used their wealth to elevate themselves into positions of cultural, political, and academic authority. While modern Americans serve long prison sentences for minor drug offenses, these early American elites trafficked narcotics on a continental scale and later rewrote history to hide their involvement. Understanding how this happened requires understanding what the opium trade really was, not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, but the brutal economic engine behind it. In the early 19th century, Britain faced a problem. It was buying enormous quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain from China. But China did not want British manufactured goods in return. Trade was wildly unbalanced, and Britain was hemorrhaging silver. To reverse the flow, Britain needed a product the Chinese population would buy in massive quantities. They found their solution in opium, grown in British-controlled India. The drug was processed, packed into chests, and shipped illegally to China, where opium smoking had been banned because officials recognized it as a societal poison. The profits were staggering. A chest purchased for a modest price in India could be sold in China for 4 to 5 times more. American traders saw the opportunity and were eager to participate. Though they did not grow opium themselves, they possessed the world's fastest clipper ships designed for speed and long-distance trade. These vessels became perfect tools for smuggling narcotics. American captains sailed to British India, loaded thousands of pounds of opium, and raced to clandestine anchorage points along the Chinese coast. They did not enter Chinese ports directly. Instead, local smugglers would row out to meet them, exchange silver for drugs, and distribute the opium throughout China. This method allowed American traders to claim plausible deniability while still reaping enormous profits. Over time, the silver extracted from China flowed into American banks and financed the rise of powerful families whose descendants now occupy the highest levels of Yaoju's institutions. Among them was Warren Delano II, grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Born in Massachusetts in 1809, he traveled to China at 19 and quickly advanced within Russell and Company, the largest American opium trading firm in the region. By 24, he was a partner, overseeing a network of clippers, warehouses, and sales agents. He spent more than a decade smuggling opium into China and returned to the United States, fabulously wealthy. He built a 40-room mansion in New York, secured elite education for his children, and when he later lost his fortune in a financial panic, he simply returned to China, resumed the opium business, and rebuilt his wealth even larger than before. His daughter, Sarah, married James Roosevelt, and their son, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, inherited the benefits of that fortune. A man whose family wealth came from drug trafficking would later sign some of the strictest anti-drug laws in American history, criminalizing substances far less harmful than the opium his ancestors sold. The Astor family followed a similar path. Although history books often highlight John Jacob Astor's fur trade, the majority of his truly transformative profits came from opium trafficking. His ships sailed to China, carrying Turkish opium, traded it for silver, and then reinvested that silver into other goods. By 1840, Astor was worth an estimated $20 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. And much of that wealth formed the foundation of the legendary Astor dynasty, whose name still adorns hotels, libraries, and philanthropic institutions. The Forbes family likewise entered the opium business early. Robert Bennett, Forbes, and John Murray Forbes, operating from Boston, commanded clipper ships, partnered with Russell and Company, and moved huge quantities of opium along the Chinese coast. Their profits financed railroads, real estate empires, and eventually the media empire that became Forbes magazine. Their statues still stand in Boston, their names honored, while their connection to narcotics trafficking is carefully omitted from public memory. The pattern repeats again and again. The Perkins family poured opium profits into institutions like the Perkins School for the Blind and endowed fellowships at Yale. The Russell family, whose founder created Russell and Company, used opium money to help establish Skull and Bones at Yale, a society that would later produce some of the most influential figures in American politics and intelligence. The Cabot family, another pillar of Boston aristocracy, quietly built its early wealth on drug smuggling. The Low family, whose descendants went on to lead Columbia University and New York City, financed their influence through the same trade. What emerges is a clear, undeniable pattern. American elites of the 19th century made their fortunes by selling addictive drugs to China, then used those fortunes to construct the political, academic, and financial power structures of the modern United States. Their philanthropic legacies, memorials, and institutional contributions were all built on money extracted from the suffering of millions. As the 19th century progressed, American involvement in the opium trade expanded with ruthless efficiency. By the 1830s, American firms controlled roughly 10% of all opium entering China, while British companies dominated the rest. Though 10% might sound small, it represented thousands of chests each year, with each chest weighing around 40 pounds. The scale was industrial, supported by warehouses, shipping fleets, networks of local intermediaries, and sophisticated financial arrangements that allowed the profits to wash seamlessly into the American economy. A single voyage could produce profits of 400 to 500%, enough to turn a ship captain into a wealthy man and a merchant into a millionaire. In today's money, many of these fortunes would qualify as billionaire-level wealth. But while profits soared, human suffering in China deepened. By the 1830s, somewhere between 10 and 12 million Chinese were addicted to opium. The drug infiltrated every layer of society, devastating rural families, draining the labor force, collapsing productivity, and bleeding the nation of silver. At the same time, Chinese officials witnessed how opium addiction was weakening the empire's capacity to govern, defend itself, and maintain economic stability. To combat this crisis, the Qing government appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu, a determined and incorruptible official, to end the trade. Lin wrote powerful letters demanding Britain stop the trafficking. They were ignored. Eventually, he confiscated and destroyed roughly 1,000 tons of British opium in Canton, an act that would provoke the First Opium War. Britain responded with overwhelming naval force, steam-powered warships, and modern artillery obliterated antiquated Chinese defenses. The result was the Treaty of Nanjing, which forced China to open ports, cede Hong Kong, and pay massive reparations. Though the treaty did not explicitly legalize opium, it crippled the Chinese government's ability to enforce its ban, making widespread smuggling inevitable. American traders benefited from the conflict as well. With British firms disrupted during the war, companies like Russell and Company filled the gap, expanding their networks and deepening their involvement in the trade. After the war, both British and American firms resumed smuggling at even higher levels. The Second Opium War, fought by Britain and France in the 1850s, pressured China into fully legalizing opium and opening even more ports. Again, American merchants found ways to benefit, even though the United States was officially neutral. By the time the drug was legalized, addiction had already crippled the health, economy, and morale of the Chinese population. Yet in Boston, New York, and Connecticut, the families responsible were building mansions, endowing universities, and establishing family legacies that would shape American power for generations. The greatest irony, and perhaps the greatest insult to history is that the same families who amassed wealth by trafficking narcotics later became champions of drug criminalization in the United States. In the early 20th century, as opium use rose among immigrant communities in America, political pressure grew to ban the substance. The elites who once profited from selling opium to millions now called for strict prohibition at home. Their wealth was already secured. They no longer welcomed competition. By pushing for prohibition, they created an environment where drug use was seen as a moral failing and a criminal act rather than a social and economic issue. America soon became one of the global leaders of the anti-opium movement, culminating in the Hague Opium Convention of 1912 and the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914. The United States publicly positioned itself as a defender of moral righteousness, conveniently ignoring that its own elite families had played a major role in turning opium into a weapon of mass destruction in China. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whose grandfather had enriched himself through the trade, signed federal drug control laws that shaped modern narcotics policy. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. It is as though the arsonist, having burned down another nation's house, later declared himself the world's authority on fire safety. The whitewashing of this history has been thorough and intentional. Visit the FDR Presidential Library, and the Delano family's involvement in the opium trade receives only a brief, sanitized mention, described simply as trade with China. Consult mainstream histories of the Astor family, and opium is relegated to a footnote, overshadowed by romantic tales of fur trading and real estate ventures. The Forbes family's official narrative emphasizes railroads, philanthropy, and publishing, but conveniently avoids discussing the ships that once carried narcotics to Chinese shores. Yale University celebrates Samuel Russell as a generous benefactor, but rarely addresses the origin of his fortune. Harvard's Cabot House honors the Cabot name, but does not explain that the family's early wealth was built not on commerce alone, but on the sale of a substance that enslaved millions through addiction. These omissions are not accidental. They reflect a long-standing effort by America's elite to erase the origins of their wealth. Early family biographers ignored incriminating financial records. University administrators accepted donations with the implicit understanding that no one would ask where the money came from. Museums, libraries, and archives curated exhibitions that highlighted philanthropy while avoiding uncomfortable questions. Even descendants of these families often grew up unaware of how their ancestors truly made their fortunes. Generations of Americans have been taught a version of history that glorifies the very people who destabilized an entire nation for profit. Yet the truth remains indelible because the evidence remains. Shipping records document the quantities of opium transported. Letters between merchants describe smuggling strategies, bribery, and business partnerships. Account books detail profits in silver and reinvestment into American industries. Chinese records describe the spread of addiction, the collapse of local economies, and the political chaos exacerbated by foreign narcotics. British parliamentary debates from the era openly discuss the importance of opium revenue for maintaining colonial rule in India. Together, these sources form a comprehensive and irrefutable historical picture. Despite this, the vast majority of Americans are unaware of the role their nation played in the Opium catastrophe. In Chinese classrooms, the Opium Wars are taught as fundamental events that shaped national identity, marking the beginning of what China calls its century of humiliation. Every student learns how Western powers, including the United States, flooded their country with drugs, waged war to protect the trade, and forced open its markets. In contrast, American textbooks rarely mention the wars at all, let alone America's involvement. The result is a profound imbalance in historical awareness. China remembers vividly, while America forgets by design. This imbalance has consequences. It shapes diplomatic tensions, fuels mistrust, and fosters misunderstandings that persist into the present day. Modern Americans wonder why Chinese leaders bring up 19th century events in 21st century negotiations, unaware that the trauma caused by the opium trade remains deeply embedded in Chinese cultural memory. Meanwhile, the families whose ancestors profited continue to enjoy the privileges of wealth, influence, and respect that originated in one of the most destructive narcotics enterprises in history. But the story does not end with historical amnesia or the moral transformation of former smugglers into respectable philanthropists. The legacy of the opium trade continues to reverberate in ways that are subtle, structural, and deeply embedded in modern global systems. To understand this, one must recognize that the opium trade was not simply a dark episode of 19th century imperialism. It was a foundational moment in the creation of the globalized economy, shaping patterns of wealth accumulation, international finance, and geopolitical power that endure today. Many of the fortunes built on opium did not disappear. They evolved. They were invested into railroads, banking, insurance, manufacturing, media, real estate, and political institutions. Over time, the origins of that capital were washed clean by generations of respectable business activity, transformed into dynastic wealth that now seems far removed from the drug that funded it. Consider the Russell family. Samuel Russell's opium profits flowed into investments that eventually helped build infrastructure across New England. Later descendants married into other influential families, expanded business holdings, and contributed to the creation of educational institutions whose endowments still benefit from the compounding of that early wealth. The Astors, beginning with opium alongside fur, shifted their capital into New York real estate, becoming one of the most powerful property-owning families in American history. Their descendants helped shape Manhattan, funded major cultural institutions, and entered politics. Today, their legacy appears intertwined with the very identity of New York City. Yet its foundation was partially laid on the suffering of distant strangers. The Delano family, meanwhile, parlayed opium money into trans-Pacific shipping networks, banking interests, and political connections. Warren Delano Jr., after retiring from the China trade, returned to American finance several times, rebuilding his fortune after setbacks, and passing a significant inheritance to his children. His grandson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, rose to become President of the United States and is remembered as one of the most transformative political figures of the 20th century. But the wealth that supported the Roosevelt dynasty did not emerge solely from clever investments or domestic industry. It was seeded by the profits of a drug that destabilized an empire and weakened a civilization. Families like the Cabots, Perkinses, and Forbeses likewise reinvested opium income into industries that defined America's industrial age. They funded textile mills, shipyards, and railroads. Later, they founded banks, railroad companies, and trading firms that helped lay the groundwork for America's economic expansion. These organizations, whether explicitly tied to their name or not, became pillars of American capitalism. Their philanthropic arms funded hospitals, libraries, art museums, and elite universities. Over time, the wealth became synonymous with civic virtue, public service, and national prestige. This transformation was not accidental. It followed a familiar pattern. Wealth generated through morally dubious means becomes socially acceptable once it is sufficiently old, sufficiently laundered, and sufficiently intertwined with the institutions that define national identity. America is not unique in this respect. Similar transformations occurred in Britain, where families made fortunes in slavery, colonial exploitation, and the opium trade, only to reinvent themselves as patrons of culture and education. But in the United States, the process was especially effective because the nation, young and eager to define itself, was deeply willing to forget the uncomfortable parts of its past. Meanwhile, the global aftermath of the opium trade unfolded across continents. In China, addiction lingered for generations. Even after opium was officially banned in the early 20th century, millions remained dependent. Warlords financed their armies using opium profits. Bandits raided villages to secure supplies. Peasants, driven by poverty, cultivated poppy fields as a last resort. Foreign powers continued to manipulate China's internal politics through narcotics. The Chinese Communist Party, upon taking power in 1949, launched one of the most aggressive anti-drug campaigns in world history, executing traffickers, treating addicts, and destroying fields. Within a few years, opium addiction, which had ravaged China for over a century, was nearly eradicated. This success is often cited in Chinese political discourse as a testament to national determination and historical justice. It is also part of the reason why modern China is extremely sensitive to foreign interference, especially when it resembles past patterns of exploitation, any reminder of the Opium Wars. No matter how subtle, resonates deeply within Chinese society. To this day, Chinese museums display confiscated opium pipes, war correspondence, treaties, and artifacts from British and American traders as warnings for future generations. Never again allow foreign powers to dictate China's destiny. Yet in the United States, the connection between past and present remains obscured. Americans tend to view drug epidemics through a purely domestic lens. When discussing the opioid crisis of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, attention is focused on pharmaceutical companies, doctors, regulators, and addicts. Rarely does anyone acknowledge the irony that the United States, which once trafficked narcotics into China, now faces its own opioid epidemic on a catastrophic scale, one that has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans. The patterns are disturbingly similar. A substance promoted by powerful commercial interests, regulatory failure, mass addiction, social collapse, and eventually a wave of lawsuits and public outrage. Yet the historical parallel is almost never discussed publicly. It is as though a nation that once poisoned another with opioids has, in an act of historical symmetry, found itself poisoned by opioids in return. This is not to imply direct causation, but to recognize a thematic echo, the dangers of commodifying addiction, the consequences of prioritizing profit over humanity, and the recurring tendency of powerful institutions to protect their wealth at the expense of public well-being. The universities funded by opium fortunes also play a subtle role in shaping the modern world. Yale, Harvard, and other elite institutions continue to educate world leaders, influence public policy, and shape cultural narratives. Their endowments, which contain early contributions from opium-derived wealth, now exceed tens of billions of dollars. These endowments generate returns that finance scholarships, research programs, and global influence. The contradiction is stark. Institutions that pride themselves on promoting enlightenment, social responsibility, and global leadership remain partly built on money earned from a drug that devastated an entire civilization. Yet this contradiction is rarely explored in university classrooms or acknowledged in official histories. The United States has never formally confronted its role in the opium trade, never apologized, and never engaged in public reckoning. This silence is strategic, not accidental. Acknowledging the truth would mean recognizing that America, often portrayed as a moral leader in global affairs, participated in one of the most destructive narcotics operations in world history. It would also mean confronting the privileged position of families whose wealth still shapes the country's political and economic landscape. But history, even when suppressed, has a way of resurfacing. In recent years, scholars, journalists, and independent researchers have begun re-examining the opium fortunes that seeded American wealth. Digitized archives, shipping logs, and genealogical records have made it easier to trace financial connections once hidden behind vague phrases like trade with China. Public discourse about colonialism, corporate power, and historical injustice has opened new space for discussing topics once considered taboo. And as China asserts itself on the world stage, references to the opium wars appear increasingly in political speeches, diplomatic exchanges, and cultural conversations, reminding the world that the past is not as distant as it seems. Yet the most powerful change may come from ordinary people who seek to understand history, not as a sanitized national myth, but as a complex story filled with uncomfortable truths. Only by acknowledging the real origins of wealth and power can societies begin to address the inequalities that persist. And only by understanding the legacy of the opium trade can Americans grasp the full extent of their nation's entanglement with global systems of exploitation. Understanding this forgotten history does not require assigning guilt to descendants or condemning every institution touched by tainted wealth. Rather, it requires honesty. It requires recognizing that nations, like individuals, have shadows, parts of their past that they would prefer to hide, revise, or ignore. For the United States, the opium trade is one of those shadows. It reveals that America was not merely a passive observer of 19th century imperialism, nor a nation driven solely by ideals of freedom and moral progress. It participated actively in a global system of exploitation, profiting from the destruction of another society's well-being, and the families who benefited became pillars of American respectability. But confronting this truth can offer something valuable: clarity. It can help Americans understand that wealth does not emerge from thin air, that power is rarely innocent, and that the global order we live in today was shaped not only by innovation and hard work, but also by coercion, addiction, and human suffering. When a country acknowledges the darker parts of its past, it gains a more complete understanding of itself. It becomes more capable of empathy, humility, and responsible leadership. For China, the story of the opium trade continues to serve as a reminder of vulnerability, resilience, and national revival. It explains why sovereignty is treated with such seriousness, why foreign interference is met with suspicion, and why historical memory plays such a central role in the country's political discourse. The humiliation inflicted during the opium era is not simply a narrative promoted by the state. It is a lived memory, passed through generations, embedded in family stories and cultural consciousness. The ruins of old opium dens, the ashes of burned fields, the scars of forced treaties, and the humiliation of military defeat continue to echo through museums, school curricula, and public monuments. These memories are not relics. They remain active forces shaping China's relationship with the world. Meanwhile, in the United States, the absence of these memories has created a gap in understanding, one that fuels misunderstanding and misinterpretation in both directions. When Americans dismiss Chinese references to the Opium Wars as outdated or irrelevant, they reveal more about their own historical ignorance than about China's perspective. To understand today's geopolitics, one must understand yesterday's wounds. And few wounds run deeper than those inflicted by addiction, weaponized as economic leverage. The legacy of the opium trade also challenges modern narratives about morality in international affairs. Nations often present themselves as guardians of order, justice, and civilization. But historically, economic interests have repeatedly overshadowed ethical concerns. The opium trade was justified through rationalizations that sound eerily familiar. Today, it is legal under our laws. If we do not do it, someone else will. The market demands it. It is simply business. We cannot interfere with free trade. These arguments, used by 19th century merchants and politicians, are not so different from the language corporations use today when defending practices that harm the vulnerable. The past, in this sense, is not past at all. It is a mirror. And yet, within this dark history lies a lesson about change. Nations can evolve. Families can reinvent themselves. Institutions can transform their missions. The same universities that once accepted opium, funded endowments, now conduct research that exposes injustice. The same country that once brought narcotics into China now grapples with its own opioid crisis and debates public health approaches to addiction. Acknowledgement, however delayed, is still possible. But acknowledgement requires attention, and attention requires curiosity. The story of America's role in the opium trade has remained obscure, not because it is unknowable, but because it has been inconvenient. It disrupts patriotic narratives, challenges powerful families, and complicates moral claims. Yet history does not care about convenience. It simply waits to be seen. For the families whose wealth originated in opium, the truth is not an accusation. It is context. It explains how fortunes were built, how influence was accumulated, and how certain names became synonymous with American prestige. It also reminds us that behind every grand estate, every cherished library, and every philanthropic foundation lies a story that may contain both brilliance and cruelty. The value of understanding such stories is not to condemn the present for the sins of the past, but to illuminate the past so that the present can be more honest. And for the descendants of those who suffered in China, understanding this history is a form of recognition. It affirms that the addiction, poverty, and humiliation endured by their ancestors were not the result of personal weakness or cultural failure, but of deliberate policies pursued by foreign powers. It acknowledges that their history was shaped by forces beyond their control, that their nation's struggles were inflicted rather than inherent. Recognition does not erase trauma, but it offers dignity. In the end, the full story of the opium trade shows that history is neither simple nor clean. It is filled with contradictions. Philanthropists who were once smugglers, nations that preach morality after profiting from vice, institutions that celebrate enlightenment while being built on exploitation. To accept this is not to diminish the good that came afterward, but to see clearly the complexity of human societies. And clarity matters. Without it, nations repeat their mistakes. Without it, dialogue collapses into misunderstanding. Without it, the powerful rewrite the past to justify the present. But with it, a society gains the ability to analyze itself honestly, to understand its relationship to others, and to face the future with a deeper awareness of the forces that shaped its path. Ultimately, the story of the American opium families is not merely about drugs or profits or war. It is about the origins of modern power. It is about how global systems were built on choices, sometimes noble, often destructive, made by individuals who believed they were shaping the world. And they did. Their choices still echo across oceans, across generations, and across the geopolitical tensions of today. History remembers, even when people forget. The question is whether we choose to look away or choose to finally see